Tonight on Arise America, countdown to midnight for a budget deal. The Senate and the House are negotiating a spending plan to avoid another government shutdown. Throwback Thursday for the stock market. Another day, another wild ride. And more people are living to 100. Which countries are people living right, and which ones are they not? That and more next on Arise America. Welcome to Arise America. I'm Andrew Schmertz. On a day the Dow dropped more than 1,000 points, lawmakers in Washington are still trying to come up with a plan to fund the U.S. government. The drop in the Dow puts the markets technically in a correction phase, which is 10% off its highs. We'll have more on the markets in a few minutes. Meanwhile, the rush to the finish line on Capitol Hill as legislators negotiate a sweeping budget deal that would fund the government for 2 years. The Senate already has a deal. Now it's up to the House, and that might be the tough part. Our Washington, D.C. correspondent Eric Ham is here to bring us up to date with the fast-moving developments. Good evening, Eric. What's the latest?
Good evening, Andrew. Yeah, there's so much going on right now, and actually we've got some new developments taking place. But before we get to that, let's just show our viewers actually what's in this budget and what lawmakers will be voting on if it actually comes to the floor for a vote. So right now what we see is there's a $165 billion for defense spending, which increases this defense spending. And in addition, there's $128 billion for non-defense spending, another $90 billion in this bill for disaster relief for Puerto Rico, Florida, and Texas as a result of the hurricanes, and an additional $6 billion for the opioid crisis. So we're talking more than $300 billion in new spending in this bill. Now, there are a couple hiccups that's taking place right now. The first is Kentucky Senator Rand Paul is actually holding the bill up in the Senate before it can actually come to the floor for a vote. So while we think it was supposed to be pro forma for the members in the Senate to actually pass this bill, we know that lone Senator Rand Paul has yet to agree to allow the bill to come to the floor for a vote. In addition to that, we know that now Nancy Pelosi, and I think we have some footage of that, she was actually on the floor for a record 8 hours yesterday lambasting this bill, saying that she would not support it. And just today she came out saying that she would whip up her members of the Democratic caucus to not support the bill. So in addition to House Democrats potentially not supporting the legislation, you also have a conservative House Freedom Caucus members in the House who are unhappy with the rising deficits that this bill will bring along. So it's not quite clear if this bill will actually get through. And remember, we're only hours away until there's another shutdown to take place.
Paul Ryan says that he thinks he has the votes, but it is coming out that members of the Freedom Caucus on the right may vote against it. And if Pelosi gets all the Democrats, this bill goes down the drain.
Not only that, but if Rand Paul doesn't allow the senators to bring the bill to the floor, I mean, we've got a two-front war taking place in both chambers. So this is getting very tricky right now. It could be a long night, at least for me here in Washington.
Well, it's usually when no one likes the bill on the left or the right. That's kind of the compromise people are looking for. From your general sense, is there any other options here? Is there a continuing resolution that's on the table just so we don't wake up in the morning and the lights are not on at the Capitol?
No, this is actually the only bill this is the only game in town right now. Is this piece of legislation that they need to get through. And so I think what you're seeing, particularly on the Senate side, are Republicans trying to do what they can to give assurances to Rand Paul in terms of the deficit spending in this bill. But again, we don't know how long he will continue to place a hold before he allows the bill to come to the floor. So that's the holdup right now in this. Now, if we get past his hold, this bill will definitely go through the Senate at least. Will it get through the House? We do know that Speaker Ryan, he believes the bill can get through, but he needs everything to break his way, and right now we're just not so sure that's going to happen.
And where is the president tonight? Is he out there twisting any arms?
Well, absolutely. Well, in that case, no. But we do know that the president is supportive of the legislation that we are seeing that at least coming out of the Senate. I mean, he sent out a tweet saying that he thinks it's a good bill. Now, keep in mind, this bill does not do anything for DACA protections. It does not provide funding for the wall that he has called for. But even without that, and we know that he has said without those protections, without increased border security, he wanted to see a government shutdown. So we're seeing a complete 180 from the president on that front. Now he's just got to try to get his caucus members, his Republicans in both the Senate and the House to actually go along with this. And I think that's going to be a big hurdle for the Republicans to overcome right now.
Okay, well, a former president is speaking now. President Bush says that he believes there's evidence of clear Russia involvement in the meddling of U.S. elections. What did he say today?
That's right. The president actually is speaking in the UAE today, and this was actually very stunning to have a former president speak out so forcefully on this issue that has been dogging the current White House since the inauguration. If we could just take a look at what he said, and I'll come back on the other end.
Problematic that a foreign nation is involved in our election system, because democracy is really only as good as the people trust the results. And there's pretty clear evidence that the Russians meddled. Whether they affected the outcome is another question, but they meddled, and that's dangerous for democracy. I'll remind you, however, that during the Cold War they did the same thing, and they're very adept at trying to manipulate opinion, and whether it be here or in Europe, and they're still active in Europe like they are in the United States. I don't mean here, I meant there, America. Anyway.
Now, the president was very forceful in his comments, but keep in mind, he did not mention President Donald Trump by name, but he was very clear and very sure-footed about the Russian meddling. So this is very striking, considering a former president, a member of the current president's own party, making these comments, making these statements about Russia's engagement.
And speaking of Russia, the National Prayer Breakfast was today. Did the Russians infiltrate that too?
Yeah, this is very striking. Today we had the National Prayer Breakfast, and this is an event that we see take place annually in Washington. In fact, it's the event that put Ben Carson on the map when he spoke out against President Obama. And so here today we had the president at this prayer breakfast, and what was so striking, what was so surprising, was you saw 3 times as many more Russian nationals at this event than what we've seen at any time in recent history. And so I think that begged the question for many reporters and people who were in the audience: what is going on? The fact that you had so many there. Now, the organizers of the breakfast do not release what goes into actually the invitations to bring people in, but it was just very surprising that you had so many Russians. And what we do know is this is an event, not only is it a prayer breakfast, but many see it as a perfect opportunity to get your issues in front of the particular administration that's in power. And so we see the Russians using their influence at every turn to try to engage with the current administration.
All right, and real quick, Eric, we have to talk about Rob Porter. He resigned from the White House yesterday. The White House in a bit of drama today. They said late in the day, I believe, that they could have acted differently.
They did. Well, they just wrapped up the press briefing over at the White House. We do know that Rob Porter, he was accused of domestic violence over his 2 wives, but now he's out of the White House. And again, it's just another scandal that this administration is going to have to deal with.
All right, Eric Ham in Washington, D.C. Stay on the budget for us tonight. Thank you. As Eric mentioned, both chambers of Congress have until midnight to vote on the spending bill, but House Democratic leader Nancy Pelosi has already said she will vote against it if it does not include protections for the so-called dreamers. Those are immigrants brought here illegally to the United States as children. During Pelosi's marathon talks, protesters demanding the bill included a provision for DACA and staged a sit-in the Capitol Rotunda. Several demonstrators were arrested by Capitol Police. Well, joining us now to discuss the issue is Carmen Maria Ray, Acting Director of the Immigration Intervention Project at Sanctuary for Families, an organization that advocates for immigrant families. Welcome to you. Thank you for joining us. So Speaker Paul Ryan today said, and he talked about Nancy Pelosi, and that grabbed his attention apparently, that they will come up with a DACA deal, but separate from the budget. What do you think of that?
I think we've had this conversation already. This was the agreement that the Democrats in the White House seemed to have kind of negotiated the last time that we agreed to not shut down the government. Personally, I don't think we would support waiting further for a solution to the Dreamers.
So if Congress, so you would like to see it as part of the budget deal?
It should be part of it.
Is that because of a pressure thing? It kind of connects?
I think many of us are concerned that if we don't make it part of the budget deal, a solution is not going to actually get passed.
And so there's a danger that if it doesn't happen now, Congress won't pick it up.
No.
Where does, you're taking the temperature of lawmakers on Capitol Hill. Do you think there is enough power now to get this through? You did have Nancy Pelosi for 8 hours, and that grabbed a lot of attentions. And like I said, the Speaker's attention as well.
I think a lot of the national organizations that are working directly on this issue feel that there is a lot of interest in creating a solution for Dreamers. But there is definitely deep concern that if it doesn't pass as part of the budget deal, we will not get a solution to Dreamers.
Okay, so what's at stake? The deadline March 8th?
March 8th, yes.
Unless the president extends his previous cancellation.
Right, and which I've been led to believe that this is not actually going to happen from the White House. This White House will not create a solution. So we are basically looking at having 800,000 people without immigration status in the United States. About 122 people lose status every day. Just because the White House has, of course, created that kind of artificial deadline of October 5th for people to renew their applications, and with just weeks' notice, over 22,000 DACA qualified children, adults, people
lose their status.
Lost their status.
And even though the Chief of Staff, John Kelly, who waded into this, he didn't need to wade into it, but he waded into it, said they're not going to be deporting them isn't a priority. If you lose your status, you can't work. Is that correct?
If you lose your status, you can't work. In many states, you can't drive. You can't support your family. You are then living under fear of deportation. And with all due respect to Mr. Kelly, who, of course, headed the Department of Homeland Security for a heartbeat, we are seeing DACA recipients being deported on a daily basis.
So what does your organization propose is done here?
A clean DACA. I mean, if we can't pass it today as part of the budget deal, we need a clean DACA. DACA recipients need to stop being held hostage by the administration.
What about the president's proposal, 1.2 million people included in his proposal, if Congress funds the wall?
I don't think that we would support that, and neither would most immigrant organizations in the United States. The wall doesn't solve our immigration problem, which really amounts to about 11 million people who have no immigration status in the United States, and under the president's solution, have no pathway to citizenship.
And the president's, I think the president had a pathway to citizenship, no?
For 1.5 million DACA-related applications, but it doesn't address their families, and it doesn't address the remainder of individuals who have been brought to the United States for one reason or another, not the least of which because our economy requires workers and have now been left out of status. It also doesn't solve the issue of TPS recipients who the United States government has suddenly made temporary protected status for a myriad of countries, not the least of which Liberia and Sudan, also Honduras and El Salvador, who the U.S. government has stripped of the immigration status that many held for up to 30 years in this administration. So we have now made millions more people undocumented as a result of this administration's decisions on immigration. And the White House's position doesn't resolve their lack of immigration status.
What are you hearing from the so-called sanctuary cities? So we're here in New York City. New York City said it'll protect the immigrants. What kind of concern is there that there will be a conflict with federal authorities?
I think the city is very, very concerned about it, and this is a conversation that the city has had for over a year now. And the reality is that we are going to see conflict with federal authorities because we have a high concentration of DACA and TPS recipients who are now losing status in New York City.
Do you propose that the DACA immigrants who are here get their legal status, but what about future people coming in, especially kids who are brought here illegally with their parents? What would happen? What is the solution there? Because that problem is never going to stop.
No, I mean, the problem of people who lose their immigration status, and again, you do have to understand that a lot of the DACA recipients actually came in lawfully and then fell out of status for one reason or another. Our immigration laws are incredibly outdated and need updating, and every Congress talks about a
comprehensive fix, and it doesn't go
exactly, which is why we're so committed to having this pass as part of a budget bill that has to pass. I know many of us had a lot of hope in 2006 that we would get a comprehensive immigration reform.
President Bush,
under President Bush, and the Republicans have historically been proponents of immigration reform because it is so important to U.S. business interests to have a kind of very transparent immigration system.
What are businesses saying this time around?
They're petrified. You talk to Microsoft, you talk to Facebook, Google, many of their engineers, many of their workers are actually documented, and they're about to lose employees that are incredibly valuable to organizations. We have some organizations in New York that have upwards of 180 employees who are documented and looking to lose status within, if not immediately, within the next year to a year and a half.
So, opponents of DACA simply say it's a matter of law. They came here illegally. Doesn't matter that their parents brought them in.
No.
And how do you respond to that?
I say I came here illegally. I was undocumented for a long time, and I was given an opportunity, and now look at me today. DACA kids are just like me.
And the vast majority, correct? The vast majority
Yes.
are working, are paying taxes, and are contributing to the economy.
In fact, you are basically required to demonstrate that you're an upstanding member of American society in order to be able to receive DACA benefits. Anyone that says otherwise doesn't understand the law.
All right, so walk us through what you think will happen on March 8th if we don't get a deal.
We're going to start having very valuable employees and contributing members of our society
And that's
lose their ability.
And that's the big threat. They're not getting kicked out of the country right away, but they can't work.
Right.
And
so
then they go on public assistance, correct?
Well, no, because you can't get public assistance unless you're undocumented. Right. Whatever the city, if you don't have immigration status, you don't get public assistance, categorically. There are cities where you can get emergency Medicaid, but otherwise, you do not get any public assistance. Again, this is clear. There even in sanctuary cities like New York, unless you can demonstrate that you have been granted the ability to stay in the United States, you don't get any public assistance from any public benefit.
Where are most of the DACA immigrants located? Are they mostly in big cities?
No. They're located across the United States.
That's a myth, right? Because that they're only in New York, San Francisco.
No, absolutely.
Right?
In fact, what we've seen about immigration in the last 20 years in the United States is that the big magnets for immigration are actually rural areas that need workers to staff farms, and families moved in together as families to be able to do those jobs that Americans aren't doing because Americans are the ones that are moving out of rural communities and into cities.
Okay. Carmen Maria Ray, you'll stay on top of it, of course, and hopefully you'll come back.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks for joining us. Next, the Wall Street roller coaster ride continues. We'll have the latest, plus an iconic cup is about to disappear. You're watching Arise America. A turbulent Thursday for the markets tops our business news. We have an alliteration for every day of the week when it comes to business news. Take a look at Wall Street. It was an ugly day. The market slid early and often. The Dow Jones Industrial Average closing down 1,032.89. That's down better than 4%. It does put the Dow in correction territory. That's defined as 10% off its highs. The S&P 500 and the NASDAQ followed suit, also both down about 4%. All of this coming on pretty good economic news. Weekly jobless claims fell to a near 45-year low. Those filing first-time unemployment claims fell to 221,000, better than estimated. That's the lowest level since 1943. Tweet this, first-time profits for Twitter. Twitter reported earnings of $91 million. That's the first time in history that they reported profits. And 330 million people use Twitter at least once a month, and one of those people in the White House. An electric car maker, Tesla, reported better than expected quarterly results. In a week when founder Elon Musk launched a Tesla Roadster into space, the company announced it lost less money than expected. Tesla says it lost narrowed to $276 million, and that eased investor concern about Tesla's cash burn. Tesla expects to deliver 100,000 of the new Model S sedans, but warns orders far outpaces its ability to make them. And Dunkin' Donuts is ditching styrofoam cups. The Boston-based coffee and donut shop will join the eco-friendly crowd by doing away with the cups by 2020. It's a risk for Dunkin', which relies heavily on coffee sales. The famous Dunkin' Donuts logo with the styrofoam coffee cup, though, will not change. And it pays to be in the gardening business, especially when your customers buy your supplies to grow marijuana. A Florida man who sells indoor gardening equipment will get to keep some of the $22 million in cash that he stuffed in buckets. Luis Hernandez-Gonzalez pled guilty to money laundering, and Wednesday he argued that he sold the equipment to people growing pot in states where it's legal, and that he had no choice to keep the cash because banks in Florida wouldn't take it. Hernandez-Gonzalez faces up to 30 years in jail, but he is being allowed to keep $4 million. And maybe he can spend some of that money at McDonald's to show his love this Valentine's Day. Yes, McDonald's. Mickey D's is giving away an 18-carat, $12,500 diamond ring to the person who writes the wittiest tweet. It's not exactly on the dollar menu, is it? The Bling Mac, as it's called, was designed by Nadine Goshen. McDonald's says it's a way for people to show their Big Mac love for someone. There it is. It's all shiny and bright and lights going off. You can tweet your message at Big Mac Bling. Don't try to eat it. It's worth $12,500. And the Philadelphia Eagles showed off their bling to hundreds of thousands of adoring fans today. In freezing temperatures, Eagles players cruised along a 5-mile route through the center of the city atop an open-air double-decker bus, showing off the Lombardi Trophy. Finally ending up near the famous Rocky Steps at the city's art museum. Some of the players held up thank you signs, thank you fan signs, and others tossed T-shirts to throngs along the route. Good time. Coming up, another chapter in the Olympic molesting case. The dad that is being flooded with money. We'll explain how and why when we come back. We have reported on the numerous school shootings in the U.S. this year, but this time it was not a school, but worshipers that were attacked, and this time it wasn't a gun, but a knife. One person dead, another 3 injured. It happened in the South Texas city of Corpus Christi, where more than 24 had packed inside a house for a non-denominational service. Police arrived to find a pastor holding the service, stabbed in the chest, along with 3 others. Police arrested 28-year-old Marco Antonio Marino on suspicion of murder and aggravated assault. He's being held in jail with bail set at $1.4 million. The Detroit father who tried to attack former Olympic Dr. Larry Nassar in a Michigan courtroom is pleading with people to quit sending him money. So far, his fans have donated more than $31,000 to a GoFundMe account. Randy Margraves, who had no role in the account, says he appreciates the thought but does not want the money and is offering refunds. Any money left in the GoFundMe account next month will be donated to groups that help victims of physical abuse. Nassar assaulted Margraves' 3 daughters. Drugs, alcohol, and suicide has pushed down U.S. life expectancy for the 2nd year in a row, according to a report released yesterday in the BMJ journal. The Japanese people have some of the longest lifespans on the planet, while several countries in Africa have some of the shortest. Here to talk more about living long and aging gracefully is Dr. Nesochi Okeke-Igbokwe. Thank you for joining us today. So let's first talk. We're seeing more people live to 100+ years. We could talk about whether we have the infrastructure and the medical care to support them, but what is driving the longevity first?
A few things are driving longevity, and it's not just one thing. It's really a multifactorial approach. One thing we look at are genetics. That's certainly one component as to why people are living longer, but that's not really the only reason why. We have to look at some of the lifestyle choices they make, specifically in regards to their dietary choices and their adherence to various modes of exercise. All those things together really encompass why we're seeing this increase in the longevity of some people.
I think people are surprised that in the United States it went down. That does not happen often. What drove that?
It doesn't happen often, but what we're seeing more is a rise in the rates of alcohol addiction, drug addiction, when we talk about the opioid
addiction.
Exactly, and increased rates of suicide. Those things are driving down the rates from what once was about 80 years old life expectancy to somewhere around 79, 78 this year.
Is there any sense that it will turn around in the United States soon?
It's hopeful that it will turn around. We're really trying to tackle the drug epidemic, and once we tackle that, we should see some higher rates in longevity amongst the population in the U.S.
Okay, so we have a chart that I want to show you of the longest longevity, if you will, of lifespans, and Japanese are among the tops. What is it about people living in these countries that do so well?
So there are certain pockets and regions of the world which we refer to as blue zones. That's where we see a higher than normal concentration of what we call centenarians, people that are living to at least 100 years and older. Some of those regions include Okinawa, Japan, Sardinia in Italy. We also see here in the USA, the one blue zone region is Loma Linda in California.
Yeah, these are called blue
zone regions, exactly. So they have higher than normal.
Is there a common thread? I mean, you can look at Monaco, but there's 30,000 people who live in Monaco, and it's always, weather's always perfect. But is there a common thread in Japan and in California and in Italy? What do those areas have in common, if anything?
So there are a few common threads that a lot of these regions share. One thing is adherence to high levels of activity, even in old age. These people have this encompassed in their everyday life, whereby they're always exercising, whether it's by means of hiking, gardening, even into their 90s, into their hundreds. They never live sedentary lives. That's never part of the equation for that. It's kind of
even the smallest exercise means something. Walking, for
exactly,
example.
Even walking.
What about eating? So Americans are notoriously overweight, but if you look at the Japanese, they are not. Is that obviously it's dietary connected?
It's certainly dietary connected. What we see with the Japanese, there are a few dietary things that they do to help control their weight. In Okinawa, Japan, they adhere to something they call hara hachibu, which means they only eat till they're 80% full. They never overeat, so this helps them avoid certain things like obesity and many of the chronic conditions that are associated with overeating and being obese.
What about Seventh-day Adventists? I understand there's a high number of 100-year-olds there. What about it? What about that group?
So there are two things with the Seventh-day Adventists that help them have higher levels of longevity. One thing is they adhere to a vegetarian diet. A lot of these blue zone regions, they adhere to more plant-based diets, very minimal amounts of meat and fish, mainly vegetarian.
And that makes sense. Heart disease is, I still believe, the #1 killer in this country.
Exactly. And also, in addition to having the healthy diet, the Seventh-day Adventists adhere to a spiritual-based lifestyle. They see their body as a temple whereby they will not allow certain things to go into their body, like processed foods, junk food. They don't smoke, they don't drink. They really look at the body and make sure that they take care of it in every aspect.
All right, so let's look at the reverse now, the countries with the lowest life expectancy. And this does not surprise us. It's poor countries that get hurt the most.
Certainly. A few countries, mostly on the African continent, they're the ones that we are seeing with the lowest life expectancy. Countries like Chad and Gabon. Unfortunately, those are the countries that have
conflict.
Exactly. They have lower than normal life expectancies as compared to the rest of the world. And some reasons why we think of that is they usually are the countries that have lower access to health care. They're usually the countries that have less access to resources when something like a disease outbreak occurs.
So like, let's take the HIV epidemic 10, 15 years ago in Africa, decimated parts of the continent. Then there was a big initiative on part of the United States to help improve it. Have we seen that turn around and increase lifespans?
Not necessarily. We still need more efforts to bring the life expectancy up in countries that are afflicted with the HIV/AIDS epidemic. We definitely need more government help in bringing the funds to make more research available to get to where we need in regards to helping some of those issues out.
And some of the biggest things, we talk about disease. Let's look at the Ebola outbreak. Nigeria did phenomenally well in controlling Ebola. And a large part of it, from what I heard, it comes down to clean water. And dirty water is a major health crisis in many of these countries.
So that, again, lends to the need for better access to provisions such as clean water, and that did help with the Ebola outbreak. But another thing that really helped with the Ebola outbreak was just preparedness. When we have an outbreak, a lot of the time, some of these countries are not ready to actually face and tackle what's to come. What Nigeria did well was they were ready, and they had a team that helped basically anyone who was involved with the Ebola virus keep them isolated from the rest of the community and really trace back who the first person was that was in contact with the virus and help them move forward to slow down that epidemic.
On a lighter note, we have this tremendous video of a 106-year-old marathon runner in India. What's his secret?
His secret is likely he's been exercising for a long period of time. He didn't just start exercising a few years ago. It's something he's been doing throughout the course of his life. And that's something that's important for all people who want to live long to really adhere to. Continue to remain active. That's the number one thing you can do to give you that endurance to still be
And there's
active.
no quick fix. You know, the diets are fashionable, out of fashion. There's no quick fix there, right? It's consistent, healthy eating.
There's never a quick fix. It's always, there's no secret to being healthy. It's really the combination of maintaining your physical activity and eating a healthy diet.
When you look at the worldwide view, what is the greatest threat, would you say, to life expectancy right now?
The greatest threat to life expectancy really is a lack of physical activity. It's really hard for most people to try to
And
get
that's something
into
we can all control.
Exactly, to get in that recommended amount of time to exercise. If you're able to get in 150 minutes per week of moderate aerobic activity, that's the amount of exercise you really
And that's
need to
basically
maintain.
30 minutes a day.
Around 30 minutes a day, and you'll be okay. And moderate activity, aerobic activity, includes simple things like just taking a nice brisk walk. Essentially, you need to be doing something that allows your heart to continue to pump and you break a little bit of a sweat.
And finally, reduce stress?
Oh, stress reduction is huge, and that's something that we see in a lot of these blue zone regions. I'll give you an example. The people of Sardinia, Italy, and also in Icaria, Greece, those are two blue zone regions. They have naps every day. When they take these naps, it helps relax them.
I have never met more relaxed people than on the islands of Santorini and Mykonos in Greece.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
Thank you very much, Doctor.
Thank
Good
you for
seeing
having me. Likewise.
Still ahead on Arise America, something really old, like tens of millions of years old. We'll introduce you to him when we come back. Welcome back. The United States military has thousands of troops on the ground in Africa with ground and air power to support them. The American footprint exploded during the presidency of Barack Obama, increasing 2,000%. Today, the Friends of Congo is holding a conference here in New York on the militarization of Africa. Zachariah Mampili is Director of Africana Studies and Associate Professor of Political Science and International Studies at Vassar College here in New York State. Zachariah, thank you and welcome to the program. You know, the ramp up in Africa has certainly been tied to the war on terror. Highly criticized, President Obama was criticized with the use of drones. How has that changed the balance a little bit of what we're doing in Africa, and have we overstepped our bounds?
Yeah, sure. I think one of the big issues right now is that much of what has been happening on the continent has moved away from an emphasis on economic development or the promotion of democracy, and has been reduced primarily to the question of the war on terror. And as you point out, that began under Obama, but certainly expect that to continue under Trump. And I think a lot of what we've been seeing across Africa reflects this emphasis on militarizing the continent rather than trying to engage in trade or other types of political relationships we might have.
You know, it's interesting because it's actually China has been credited with stepping in and developing the economic relations, and the president and the United States has fallen behind because of that. But, you know, Africa has always been militarized, right? Individual countries have always relied and overpaid for their military to the detriment of their people. What is the perception? I know it's a big continent with many different views, but what is the perception of American military in many of these countries?
I think that one of the things that you have to pay attention to in the sort of competition between the U.S. and China is that China has coupled its increasing military footprint across the continent with a very broad economic development and trade program. So even as components of its military program are criticized, it is also accompanied by a lot of goodwill, especially at the governmental level, for the kinds of trade programs that China has engaged in. In contrast, under Obama and certainly under Trump, much of the economic development programs have been cut back. Obama had a big initiative called Power Africa that was never actually led to much in terms of actually generating power for African countries, which have a deep need in that area. And instead, primarily what we see across Africa is that the U.S. has retreated from any sort of genuine political engagement with African countries. The U.S. trade footprint has decreased, and we are left instead with primarily a military footprint across the continent.
It's interesting you bring up President Obama's initiative. Electricity remains very challenging across the continent. So 4 U.S. soldiers were recently killed in Niger. There are dangers to U.S. troops throughout Africa in many of these hotspots.
Absolutely. I think one of the striking things is that yesterday there was a report that was released that was the preliminary investigation of what caused the death of those 4 soldiers. And what is clear now is that those 4 soldiers were engaged in combat activities contrary to their actual mission of just simply being a training and advisory mission. So there's 2 levels to this. One is, what are U.S. troops supposed to be doing on the continent and what are troops actually doing? And clearly they are engaging in much riskier operations that even we as the public and even many in our political class are completely unaware of.
How much transparency is there for Americans? We sort of know military presence when we see soldiers, but I imagine there are many unmarked soldiers, if you will, and including the recruitment of individuals from those countries to work for the U.S. military. So the presence may actually be much bigger than we know.
Yes, I mean, I think the average American and even, I think, academics who study these issues vastly underestimate the scale of the U.S. presence across the continent. One of the striking things about the U.S. military presence in Africa is that it's primarily special forces who are spread out across the continent. So I've heard there are over 100 different special forces teams operating in Africa in this contemporary moment. So we may pay a lot of attention to news about a base being opened up in Niger or in Djibouti, but really the majority of the activities that the U.S. military is engaged in remain outside of the public record and even are clandestine or covert to our politicians as well.
Are the U.S. military doing police enforcement in many of these countries?
Well, one of the possibly good things that the U.S. military does try to do is engage in professionalization of police and military forces. So there is a lot of training associated with the U.S. Africa Command, which is the primary body that engages with African militaries. That could be a positive thing, but like I said, much of the activities we're just unfamiliar with, and there's tension between the U.S. Africa Command and the Special Forces who aren't in a direct sort of command and control relationship with each other.
How do we end up in these countries? Do the countries have to invite us in? I take it they do.
Yes, I mean, African governments are often very weak. They rely on U.S. military support to sustain themselves, and they do sign agreements. So we have, for example, an agreement with Niger that allows us to operate a drone base in that country.
So where is the presence the largest and most needed, would you say?
Perhaps 2 different questions. I think
Let's start with the largest.
The largest is certainly probably in Djibouti, which has the only sort of proper U.S. military base on the continent. And that is kind of the site from which we engage in a variety of operations throughout the Horn of Africa and even in places like Yemen and across the Red Sea and Arabia. The need is perhaps a very different question. I think that the Sahara is a vast area. Part of our presence there is tied to legitimate security issues. There's huge numbers of human smuggling networks that transverse across the Sahara where potentially military force might be required to try to put an end to that. But I think it's important to recognize that a lot of the instability is also sown by our own actions, and so much of the destabilization of the Sahel or the Sahara region results from our 2011 intervention in Libya, where we overthrew the Gaddafi regime without putting in place any sort of efforts to prevent spillover.
And when we come back, I want to talk to you more about our behavior, our education, and whether that's having a positive or a negative effect. So we'll continue our conversation next here on Arise America. Stay with us. We continue our conversation with U.S. military presence in Africa. Zachariah Mampilli from Vassar College is here, who has been studying this and will be attending a panel tomorrow, a panel discussion on this. Let's pick it up from sort of the U.S. military's behavior and approach in Africa, because we've made mistakes in other countries where we leave and the public really hates us for a number of reasons, rightly or wrongly. Are we learning any lessons in that?
Unfortunately, not much. I mean, I think when the Africa Command was started, its mission was different than the other military commands that are part of the U.S. military structure, in that it sought to have a humanitarian role as integral to its mission. From what I understand, that humanitarian component has been largely ignored over the past few years. Folks I know who work within the Africa Command are deeply disappointed with the sense that whatever aspirations it had to do humanitarian work have been ignored in favor of kind of traditional military activities in pursuit of
And of course, there's a history of colonization, and
Sure.
that's a major problem, I would think, from a perception. But many of these countries have been obviously very unstable for years. And so I would think that initially there is some welcoming from the public when they see U.S. troop presence.
Not really, unfortunately, because I think primarily the types of governments that we align ourselves with often tend to be autocratic dictatorships. So whether we're talking about the Ethiopian military regime, the Museveni regime in Uganda, over and over we tend to form alliances not based on any shared democratic values, but rather in terms of
what's best for us.
Who is most likely to work with us in terms of pursuing our short-term interests.
Let's discuss what's going on in Congo. Bring us up to speed a little bit, because I'm not sure how much people know really is focused on Congo and the constitutional crisis that country is having right now.
Sure. The current president has been in office for quite some time now, and he was supposed to step down by the end of 2016.
Joseph Kabila.
Joseph Kabila.
How long has he been in office?
Since the late 90s.
Okay.
So a long time, and he was kind of an accidental president. He only came into office because his father passed away mysteriously. And he's managed to survive now for almost 18 years in office. And he was supposed to have stepped down last year, and well, he was supposed to step down in 2016. He did not do that. He agreed to step down in 2017. That hasn't happened.
The history of African leaders, by the way. They set a date to step down and ignored.
And so now we're in 2018, and there is some negotiation about an electoral timeline. He has made, gestures to suggest that he will step down at some point this year, but that is consistent with his behavior over the past 2 years, and as we can see, we've now entered the third year, and there's still been no progress.
And imagine it doesn't help when you look at emerging democracies like Kenya, having the problems there over the election. There may not be political will, which they often look to the United States to push through.
Yeah, I think that one of the big issues is that as an international community, we often sort of focus too narrowly on the question of elections. And many of these African leaders are able to manipulate the electoral sphere in ways that they recognize that even if they steal an election, even if they deny opposition leaders a free and fair election, that there really is no consequence as long as they hold something like an election. And I think what Kabila has learned is that as long as he continues talking to the international community, pretending like he's going along with this electoral logic, that there's nobody really is going to put tremendous amount of pressure on him to get him to step down.
There's only so much we can do, though, right?
I would disagree. I mean, I think that there are a lot of forces within Congo. I would point to the Lucha movement, the Filimbi movement, which are primarily youth activists who have done tremendous work.
We should get behind some of these
I would like to see that. The church has been very active in trying to push back. I mean, if you listen to Congolese people, churches, civil society, youth, they're consistently saying, this whole thing is a farce. There will be no election. Even if there's an election, it will be managed, and it'll be Kabila's some replacement for Kabila who doesn't change the system. And so what they keep saying to the international community, but we don't listen, is that this farce needs to end, and we need to now start placing more pressure on Kabila.
So tell us,
we have been doing stuff.
Tell us a little bit about the conference tomorrow. What's going to be discussed?
Tomorrow we will be discussing militarization in Africa, primarily focused on the U.S., but hopefully bringing in the increasing military presence of countries like China as well. As we can see, there's a tremendous amount of synergy between military regimes in Africa and the willingness of powerful states in the international system to support them. And what this has led to is an increasing militarization of the continent from the north to the south, from the east to the west. And so we're going to be talking about this, trying to make sense of it, and trying to see what alternatives could be supported for those of us who are deeply concerned about this very negative trend.
Zachariah, thank you so much. Very insightful.
Thank you so much. And let me just say that if you want to learn more about the conference, you can go to the Friends of Congo website at friendsofcongo.org.
Okay, thank you. Come back soon.
Thank you so much.
And update us on the Congo election.
Yes, absolutely.
Happens. Next, the discovery that's shedding light on an obscure part of African history. You're watching Arise America. Stay with us. Finally, animal news from millions of years ago. Archaeologists are hailing the discovery of an Egyptian dinosaur in the desert. A team of American and Egyptian researchers say the bones of the vegetable-eating giant is 70 to 80 million years old. Arise News reporter Steve Ramey has more on the historic dino discovery.
Piece by piece, and at times tooth by tooth, scientists and students in Egypt are collecting the remains of the Mansurosaurus. From the first piece, when I first saw it, I told them, if this comes out as I expect, your names will go down in history. I really told them that. Dr. Hisham Salam runs a center for paleontology at the Mansoura University. His team literally stumbled across their 70-million-year-old discovery. So I told them to spread out so we can cover as much space as possible, and we found one of the team members starting calling her colleagues. I found a lot of bones. She even called me on the phone because I was about 2 kilometers away from her, and she told me, "Doctor, there are a lot of bones. Come and see them." So I went and I saw that it was a partial skeleton of a dinosaur. That for us was a very big thing. The long-necked herbivore is believed to resemble a dinosaur discovered in Egypt nearly 20 years ago, with a 10-meter-long tail and weighing several tons. Researchers wonder what other answers could lie beneath the sand. We know that for sure, that these dinosaurs, of course, have something that eats them, as in any ecosystem. If we want to pick up 3, 2. We know that for sure, that these dinosaurs, of course, have something that eats them, as in any ecosystem. If we went to the jungle, we'll find a lion and a giraffe. So we found the giraffe. Where's the lion? That's what we're going to look for now.
For a long time, the scientists of paleontology around the world have been discovering dinosaurs in South America, in Europe, in Madagascar, but they haven't been finding them in Africa at all.
The discovery suggests a land bridge may have once existed connecting Europe to northern Africa. Paleontology in Egypt was not well known before in this way. I mean, we've made the Middle Eastern Egyptian man or the Arab man talk about dinosaurs. That's something that makes me proud about this discovery, that we were able to reach the average people in the street in the Middle East. And there is some movement, and now there is a discussion about dinosaurs. The team hopes their discovery could bring funding to finance ongoing studies. Steve Ramey, Arise News.
And now I've been to the desert on a dinosaur with no name. That's it for today. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you tomorrow here on Arise America. Good night.